you, John.
But by way of introduction, my name is Tim Johnson. I have kind of an interesting, eclectic background. I started at Big Idea Productions in the late 1990s. It was a very small, 30-person less company at the time. And I had the really unique opportunity to see it grow up to more than 200 people and making a film. And then I saw the really unique opportunity to see it shrink down to about 30 people. And we went through some really hard times and some really interesting times. But in the process, my team, we got to make all of the VeggieTales interactive titles. And yeah.
Can you turn one of those lights
I
off
can.
in this row?
We'll try the center one. How's that? All the VeggieTales interactive titles, all the VeggieTales software stuff, all the VeggieTales web stuff, and everything that was related to that. So we had a lot of fun along the way. We did pretty well to date. They're some of the best-selling Christian software games that have been released. That's really in no small part due to the actual property itself. Then since then, I've actually worked in client services, doing software development for people like McDonald's and Harley Davidson. And then I worked for another stint with Phil Vischer on Jellyfish Labs, where we were working on some DVDs called What's in the Bible, and we did another attempt at a streaming video site on the web called JellyTelly, which also included gaming on a small scale, but had a fun time doing that. So these opportunities were really, really cool, a lot of fun, and it's just a lot of fun to be able to work on things like this. So the whole thing's really been kind of a good adventure for me. But the interesting thing along the way is that I've had a chance to reinforce ideas and values in games that's been kind of a unique thing that might not have gotten a chance to at other places, and to reinforce more kingdom values, things that kind of come from the faith. And those haven't always worked, I'll be the first to admit. Sometimes we've been successful, sometimes we haven't been successful. But today I wanted to get a chance to kind of talk a little bit more about some of those things. So I want to talk today about games specifically, and I'm going to have us concentrate about things like game mechanics and game rules. I'm going to ignore story, which is really important, and I love talking about story. If you guys want to have conversations about that later, that's really great. And good games, I think, are couched in really good stories. But I actually think there's some really fun things that we can talk about when it comes to games themselves and reflecting the kingdom of God. So right now we're going to just talk about, for all intents and purposes, we're just going to talk about games and game mechanics and things like that. So a couple of ground rules that I want to go over for this morning that are going to help us to, or this afternoon rather, that are going to help us for talking about these things. One of the first, most important ones is no gurus. So I borrowed this from Chris Agilabo. He's a blogger and author. I borrowed it because I like it. And I think I've had a lot of software and web business experience and some good experience making kids games. But, and I'm here to share my thoughts, but I want us to kind of bat around some of these ideas, and these are not necessarily, set in stone. But to offer some proof that I'm not a guru, I'll tell you a quick little story. Back when we were at Big Idea, we outsourced a lot of our games, and there was a studio run by a guy named Lance that was making games for us. And while we were making some games, he sent us this little prototype of a social media thing for kids that had little penguins talking to each other. And we looked at it, and we played around with it, and we said, this is cool, but we don't really see it going anywhere. So we said good luck with that and thought this would be really cool for him to play with further. So years later, after I left Big Idea, our previous game producer sent us a link, just letting us know what that had turned into, and that was of course Lance, who's here, and that was Club Penguin. So one of the rules is that we have no gurus, and that's something that we're going to kind of operate under. So the second one we're going to operate under is that that games are fun by definition. So I'm going to walk you through how I kind of get to that. Really simple type of idea, but sometimes I think we overlook this idea, especially when we're in Christian games. So at their core, games are about play and fun, and we're not going to get all academic, but I am going to use a couple of definitions to get you through this. So a game, with our core definition, is an amusement or pastime. You're going to see in the second definition there that it's usually played or done for amusement, for that of spectators. So that's what we get for games. Our second definition, amusement. It's a condition of being entertained or occupied, light, playful, or pleasant manner. Third definition, fun, what provides amusement or enjoyment. So I'm going to put those together by the transitive property. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So games have to be fun in order to be games. So we're going to operate under that principle. And we're going to kind of keep moving through that. A game that's not fun is no longer a game. It's the reason why when your mom suggests that we turn putting your clothes away into a game, that you kind of quickly figure out that this is not much fun. That's something that my kids figure out really quickly, and it loses its appeal, and we usually don't get the clothes cleaned up and put away. This is the kind of thing where when the veil is removed, you find out that the things that aren't actually fun aren't really games anymore. So I want to bring that to our third premise, and this is where we're going to kind of get into a little more of working through sort of our practical form. And there are lots of forms of art, and this form kind of lends itself towards entertainment more than high art. And this isn't to be disparaging of games, but we're talking about the difference between maybe Beethoven's Ninth Symphony versus a game, and one of them is a piece of high art, and one of them is a piece that is meant for us to kind of enjoy ourselves, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with either of them. They're both pieces of art, and they both have redeeming values. But I'm going to rely on some work that I really value, which is a book by Dr. Best, Harold Best, called Unceasing Worship, which I'll show you in a minute. But what it does is it creates a framework for us to think about how art works and how it works within our faith. So the basic structure is that all of us are built to worship, and all of us worship something. And those of us who have decided that we will follow the way of Jesus, hopefully are worshiping God. And ideally, over time, we become more and more oriented towards worshiping God. And so, as we are worshiping God, when we create art, that becomes part of the worship that we do. And art is a piece of that. Art can fall in different parts of continuum. So there are different kinds of art. There's the complex art. There's simple art. There's art that is strange and familiar. It's variational. It's developmental. So something like Beethoven's Symphony would be complex, maybe deep and developmental. A song like the Beatles' "Hey Jude" is simple and familiar, but it's also still engaging. So we've got different kinds of art that fall in different places on the spectrum. So if we think about this art continuum, what we have these different elements of where things fall, and I think it's beneficial for us to think about where games might fall on this continuum as well. So perhaps if you think about something like Tetris, it's a little more simple and it's somewhat familiar to us, and it's somewhat entertaining and engaging. And then something like The Legend of Zelda, that's going to be more variational, and it's also familiar. And it's going to also start to get a little bit more deep and complex, depending on where it is on the continuum. So games can fall into different points on this continuum, and this creates the differences between different types of art. So a lot of this sort of leads to the question of what's the point of even talking about this? So I'm glad you asked that. The reason is I think this framework is useful for us for a lot of reasons, and it speaks to what we were talking about this morning a little bit with creativity and with art, and that is that when we think of games as art, it allows for us to think about how games are a way for us to reveal truth and for us to express the story of God in a way that is unique and different. This is kind of the trickiest piece of it. But in his book Unceasing Worship, what we hear about is the idea that art is reflective of God's truth, and to some degree, different types of art are going to give us a picture of that truth in one way or another, and we get a glimpse of it in one way or another, depending on how much of that truth can be reflected. And so, our art is kind of this extension of this worship. So by virtue of art being, or games being part of this this art, what we get is a reflection of God's truth. And this truth that we're talking about is really God's story, the story that's happened throughout history, that began with creation and continued to God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and continued through David, and then revealed through the story of Jesus. And then it took a twist in that when Jesus died and then was buried and then rose again, it went in a different direction than people thought it would. And then the church came from that. And that story is still going today. And so this story is happening. We're waiting for it to unfold, daily in whatever way it is. But art is a way for us to get glimpses of that story at any moment. So in games, we're reflecting that story, or in art, we're reflecting that story at any moment. And so that leads us to kind of the question about how can we do that? What are ways that we can reflect this? So it brings up a couple of things. One of the things that Best talks about that I really agree with is that if you take the medium, the art as it were, and you try and make it do more than it can, then you actually lose the art form, and you lose the ability for it to reflect the truth. So when you take a game and you try and explain the truth that's behind it, you actually lose the art form. So when you try and cram that story into it by teaching too much or by telling too much, you actually lose the ability for it to reflect the truth that you're trying to tell. So if you spend too much time explaining what the art is supposed to mean in the art itself, then you actually lose it. So for example, we were talking about this just the other night here. If you have in a game or in a movie a treasure that someone's seeking, and they go and they find it, and they open the treasure, and inside the treasure box is a Bible, then you've actually lost your metaphor, and you lose the power of the metaphor in the process by having a literal treasure in there be the thing that you're trying to tell people about metaphorically. Another example is when Jesus told parables, he didn't tell a parable of the man who went and bought a field because he found the Torah in it, and he gave up everything he had to buy the field which had the Torah in it. He tells a story about a man who gave up the field, or gave up everything he had to buy the field that had a treasure in it. Because otherwise, we lose the metaphor. It doesn't give us the sense that the kingdom of God is very valuable if what we say is that they went to buy something tangible in there, because we lose the metaphor. So when we try and cram too much into art, and by virtue of cramming it into art, when we cram too much into games, we end up losing the metaphor, we lose the image, and as a result, we end up losing the ability to actually pique people's interest and to tweak their minds and to maybe even capture a little bit of their hearts in the process. So I think our challenge then is to talk about what can we do in order to help games to be able to reflect the truth without overstepping the medium in and of itself. And that's really the trick that we have here. That's actually a lot to try and take in, but it's kind of an important thing, I think, for us to talk about. There are a lot of games that we have made, including me myself, where we've overstepped bounds and tried to explain too much of what's going on, and then what happens is we end up making the games not fun, and we lose something in the process. And so what we need is, we actually need art, we need games that are out there that are really great ways of reflecting the truth. And then we need people who are followers of the way of Jesus, who are among the people in the culture, who can then explain why this game is different and what it is that's in this game, and tell people what it is that they're connecting with, why it is that they see a glimpse of the big story that game is connecting with. And that's really the key. And that actually answers usually the biggest question that people have, and the biggest frustration that people, or biggest issue that people raise with this kind of approach towards art, which is, but if my art doesn't explain the gospel or doesn't explain the Bible, then how are people going to know the story of Jesus? And that's really the answer, is that what we need is all of us to be ready to explain why it is that this element of the game really speaks to someone, or this film or this story, this book, really speak to someone, so that we're among people being able to answer those questions. But the game in and of itself isn't meant to be able to relay that kind of story and that kind of information. What I wanted to do was outline a couple of values that are kingdom values, or values of the way of Jesus, and then give some examples of how they might play out in games. And then we can kind of sum up and circle back to see if there are any thoughts from all of you. And so some of the values that we're going to identify, these are shared values. These are things that we find kind of throughout society, and they're things that society's not going to say, oh yeah, that's kind of unique to the Christian faith. And then some of these are actually unique. They're things that we wouldn't necessarily find valued throughout the world. And I think that I've got some examples that I tried to find that are from sort of lowest common denominator games. So they're going to be some things that hopefully everyone recognizes and can identify. But these aren't the only values that exist. These are just some examples, and these definitely aren't the only examples that you can find out there. These are just kind of some that I found that hopefully we'd all recognize. So the first one I want to talk about is this idea. It comes from I can identify it in Ecclesiastes. But this verse is, or the set of verses is Ecclesiastes 4, 9, 10, and 12. You might recognize it. Two are better than one, because they have good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, who will withstand him? A threefold cord is not quickly broken. All right, so This first value is cooperation, and you can find this throughout Scripture, this idea that community, that two are better than one, that we're meant to do stuff together as opposed to alone. So, this is actually, I think, really cool because games, when we talk about just game mechanics and we talk about game rules, this is a really unique medium where we can program into the gameplay rule sets that you have to sort of abide by that reinforce these values. And so it creates a really unique thing. The other thing that's really kind of unique about all of these values and this approach is that it's actually not a heavy-handed way, and yet it's a way of reinforcing these things kind of throughout the games that we would design and make. So you're not necessarily proselytizing, but you are reinforcing some things that you believe. So I'm going to show you one that I really actually kind of like. My kids play this game, and this is a lot of fun. I don't know that I need the volume on this, but for anyone who's played any of the Lego games, this is throughout all the Lego games. But part of the gameplay is that you have to work with the other character. You can't actually finish the level because the characters have unique abilities and they have unique roles that you have to actually use them for in order to accomplish what you need to do in order to finish the level. So in this situation, Batman has the ability to glide, so he's going to be able to get across one of the parts of the level, but Robin actually can't get across it until Batman solves the problem for him. They have to do that, though, because Robin has to come with him in order to help get by later parts of the level. So you can't abandon Robin, and Batman has to come with him the whole time. This happens in a lot of different places in the games. Can everybody see this? Any lights off?
Maybe like.
Is that a little better? Okay, so Batman got his wings. He's going to beat up some bad guys. So now he's going to go back over here. Robin's in the water, but he can't get any further because Batman has to go and build this device here that's going to help him get Robin. Let's get that thing real quick. And then he has to inflate that boat. So Robin can't get across until Batman helps him. And one of the things that's really kind of slick about this is that you have to do it. You can't get through the game without cooperating. At the same time, you know what? My kids play this, and they don't get really frustrated with it. It's just part of the gameplay. And what they're learning along the way is that cooperation is an important element of what they do. So Robin gets his scoop here. And he's going to help finish out this level by doing that. Builds the bridge. Here, come on, hang with me. All right, so, thanks. This is really an intriguing one, I think, and Lego's done it really well because they've made it so that you have to cooperate, even if you're a single player, a one player, you actually have to cooperate through the whole thing with yourself effectively. So you learn this idea of cooperation, working together. So some of the ideas for us, just in order to help with the primer and thinking through this. In the game design stage, you can have a thing like Lego where the player has to use different characters from a team or group of friends to accomplish a task. Another might be that two-player game requires the players to compete together rather than against each other. So any of these things in game design, are just ideas of where you're trying to kind of force rules that help to reinforce some of these values. So the second value is based on Psalm 139, 13, 16. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret. Intricately I was made in secret, intricately woven from the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book was written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. So this, I think, is a verse that tells us a little bit about the value of individuality, that each of us is created uniquely, that God knows us, that there's a deep uniqueness to every single person. So there are ways that we can integrate this into games and into kind of the rule sets for games as well. Again, I'm going to use our Nintendo example, but you probably are all familiar with this. Okay, so a really simple example, but what it does is it actually allows for a person who is playing on the Wii to create their own individual Mii, as well as all kinds of different Miis. In our family, we've got a Mii for every single person. We also have one for all of our extended family, and then from there we started creating additional Miis over and over. And we have dozens and dozens and dozens of Miis wandering around on our Wii. But it creates this really cool environment where unique individual people are populating this place, and it's reflective of God's kingdom. So I think that this points to some possible ways for us to think about game design. So whether it's allowing for, similar to the way that Wii does, for players to create customizable characters in the game. Another way is for players just to express their own creativity in how the games are customized. So vehicles, houses, their base, a battle robot, or a pet. Any way that they can express individuality is a way that starts to reflect, God's kingdom. So just looking for ways that might be possible, and to reinforce the idea that we're unique, we're individuals, we are also creators in the image of God. Is, I think, a really great way for us to look at this. So the next one is coming from Matthew 13. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. We were just talking about this, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of a fine pearl, who, on finding one pearl of great value, went on and sold all he had and bought it. So this is an example of a value that is actually fairly unique to the way of Jesus, which is sacrifice and giving up of something of great value for something for future gain. And this is actually an intriguing one to me. I couldn't find a lot of really great examples of this in games, so I found a couple of trite ones, but they're kind of from some old school games. Here is our. I couldn't find an actual example of this when it actually happened, but if you remember Super Mario 3, if anyone played this, you had to, whatever item you had to decide if you were going to get the Tanuki suit when it showed up in the game. You had to give something up in order to get that, but you did need it at the time. It's not the super best example, but it was a really, really trite one, and a somewhat fun one. So this is one that's good. Another one is, and this is kind of tricky, but this is another somewhat trite one. But in Zelda, you had to sacrifice 250 rupees in order to get your blue ring. So we can sit here and we'll watch this somewhat amateur player try and get the blue ring here. But this took time and effort in order for you to build up your 255 rupees, and it represented a lot of effort and work. But there was something of pretty great value that you exchanged it for. Now this presents a little bit of a trick for us because in these examples we want to try and be careful because we don't want to teach people that this value is simply delayed gratification, because there's something even greater than that in this value, that the actual sacrifice is worth something, that actually giving up of yourself for another is worth something. So while this is kind of an interesting little example, it's not necessarily the best example, because I think what we really want to get out of this value is something a lot deeper. So one thing that we could talk about or think about is if a player upgrades their character in exchange for other character abilities, that they might have to give up something that they've earned over a long period of time, or that they really valued. That might be a way of engaging them in this idea of sacrificing something of value, especially if they don't see where that's going to play out in the near term. Another way might be to give a player benefits for diverting their path in order to help someone else, or to aid either another player or a secondary character. So those are some interesting ways that might happen, but ways that you could build into the actual gameplay this idea of sacrifice. Okay, so our fourth one is actually my favorite one to talk about. We're going to talk about this just for a little bit. So our associated scripture is, and though they found in him no guilt and worthy of death, they asked Pilate to have him executed. And when they carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he appeared to those who had come with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to his people, or to the people. So, I think it's kind of interesting. I want to talk about the value of eucatastrophe. It's interesting, J.R.R. Tolkien has actually come up multiple times already today. But eucatastrophe is a term coined by J.R.R. Tolkien. And you can find this actually in his essay on fairy stories, and you can find it in his letters. So if you ever have time to read the essays or his letters, instead of just his books, there's some really deep stuff there about his own thinking, about his writing, and about the value of fairy stories in general, which what he's talking about is fantasy or fiction stories in general when he talks about fairy stories, fairy tales. So eucatastrophe is it's built off of the prefix, or it's built off the word catastrophe. Of course, you can see that in there. But the prefix "eu" it means good. So what you've got is a good catastrophe, and it actually is defined basically as a good catastrophe or sudden joyous turn. And Tolkien explains that it's a good catastrophe where there's a sudden turn in the story for the good when everything looks bad. He says it's the mark of a good fairy story of the higher and more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give a child or a man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat, and a lifting of the heart. So this is actually really important to Tolkien, and he writes about this He doesn't write about it a lot, but when he does, it's a very important element. And the reason this is important is because he believes that every single time that a eucatastrophe is existing in a fairy story or in any literature, it's reflective of the greatest eucatastrophe that ever happened, which is Christ rising from the dead. And the only true eucatastrophe, Christ rising from the dead. And that's why artists all over the world, throughout history, have written these into fairy stories and into stories, is that they can't help it. It's there. It's part of the created order. His belief was that there's no way to kind of get around that because we're deeply connected to it. And this is actually a very interesting one to me because it's both connected to this idea of revealing the story and the truth, but also to this idea of really, great art that connects with people. So this eucatastrophe runs really, really deep. And if you look at Tolkien's stories, you see this intentionality behind these turns, these sudden twists where everything looks dark and then suddenly it turns around for joy. And so when he's doing that, every single time he's doing that, he's intentionally trying to elicit in people that joyous feeling that reminds you of the story of Jesus rising from the dead. So the question that raises for us is, are there ways for us to design games where we can tap into that same kind of turn, that same kind of moment where everything feels dark and then there's a turn and there's a joy? Now that might be a small turn, or it might be a big turn, depending on how epic the game is or how incidental the game is. But nonetheless, every single time that we sort of work off of this principle, we're revealing a small taste of the joy and opening up an opportunity to explain to people that this is a picture of the biggest eucatastrophe, the greatest eucatastrophe that has ever happened, and the true eucatastrophe, which is this big story that God has been telling, and the one that all history pivots on. So I'm going to show you a couple of really interesting, just basic, or I'm just going to show you one eucatastrophe that happens in a game, and then I want to circle back and kind of go over these again with you guys, and talk a little bit more about some of your thoughts. So let's watch what happens to this player in Mario Kart. They're still in 7th place. They're still feeling the pain. They're in 6th. They got really pretty toasted early on there. Cool. And there it is. That sudden joyous feeling. First place. All right. So that's really intriguing to me that this one can be programmed into games in a way that you can't do in a lot of other media. You can do it in a film, which is great because you see what happens and you can kind of analyze it. You can do it in a book, which is great. You can kind of analyze it. But only in a game can you do it in a way that is totally serendipitous to the person, and they can't create it for themselves. So in a story you can see it happening, but in a game you can actually bring it to the person in a way that they have no control over whether it happened or not. And so it's much more of an experience like when it happens to us in real life and when we actually see the experience of grace in the real story of eucatastrophe. And that's different from a lot of other media. So you can experience that joy in a game like we saw in Mario Kart through no work of your own. You can't calculate it, you can't make it happen. it happens, somewhat randomly, but the programmer can actually put it in there, the designer can actually put it in there as something that would be experiential to a game player in such a way that it elicits that joy in a different way than when you're watching a film, than when you're watching a book. So I think we're talking about a very unique medium that you really can't engage with that otherwise. And it can be done just simply through game design without having to engage in story yet. Just game design and through the rule sets. So that's what I think is really intriguing. These values and these ideas are all really, I think, intriguing. There are lots of these that come out of Scripture and come out of the way of Jesus. They're intriguing ones would be how can you reinforce humility in a game? That's a really unique one, but would be really interesting to try and experiment with, and many others. But all of these can be kind of tinkered with around just simply the game design and simply the game mechanics in and of themselves. I think that we can identify these ways and these ideas that can be integrated into games, and they reflect the truth. They don't explain the truth necessarily, but they reflect the truth. And I think that it's important for us to realize that that's good enough. That's what the role is of the game. Going beyond that is not the role of the game. Going beyond that and explaining it is the role of people, the role of believers in society helping to explain those things. So by treating games as art, we make sure that we think of, first and foremost, that this is an outpouring of worship to God. We want to make really great games that are fun, and we want to make sure that they are high quality, and that when we offer them to God, we say, this is my best work, and I've done a really good job of making a game that's fun, that people like playing. And we do it to the best of our abilities. I think that's a really important element that we want to take away from here. And then letting games be games is a really important thing. They can't relay the truth directly, but they can reflect it, and we can figure out different ways that we can reflect it more and more. And then, of course, finally, there are no gurus here. So these are thoughts and musings that I put together. They're not prescriptive, but hopefully conversation starters and maybe a springboard to further discussions. So I'm wondering if we can start the discussion right now and see if you guys have either questions or thoughts that we can kind of bounce off of each other.